Hello, in this video I'd like to introduce Windows composition effects. We're also going to walk through the development of an application that allows us to experiment with a number of these effects. My name's Darren May, I'm president and co-founder of Crank211. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for Windows development. At Crank211 we design and deliver universal Windows applications, web applications, cross-platform mobile, and we also develop and deliver training courses. You can find me on Twitter at Darren May and on the web at www.crank211.com. So what is a composition effect? Well, it's basically a brush effect that is applied to an image. Now I have image in quotes here because it doesn't have to be an image that we download from the internet or off our hard disk or whatever. It also could be the outcome of the rendering of a XAML element that we then take that outcome and apply an effect to that, which then creates a new outcome. They are focused on sprite visuals because sprite visuals is where we can use a brush to paint content onto, and then we can insert that sprite visual into an element as a child so that it gets rendered on the screen. The neat thing about brush effects is they're performed at a very low level by DirectX and so on, which means that they can run real time. So not only would we apply them to, say, a static image, we can apply them to the continual outcome of rendering of controls or, say, video playback, or in fact the outcome of a webcam. So they're very, very high performance. The other really neat thing about them is that they have a series of properties that we can animate, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Of course, my video here is really going to be just a high-level overview of what composition effects are. If you want to see more detail about that, by all means visit the Microsoft documentation. So, as I mentioned, composition effects exist, but they're really a subset of what's currently available in Win2D, and there's some reasons around that, in that Win2D is often more applied to static images than it is real-time images, and so there are different performance metrics that need to be hit to perform well as part of composition. That said, I know they're adding more as they go. Here's an example of some of the types of effects that exist. So blend allows you to take two input sources and blend those things together. Contrast, as the name suggests, allows you to adjust the contrast of an image. Gaussian blur gives us a nice blur effect, which you'll see demonstrated in a few examples later on, but it's kind of the basis of the glassy effect that we may remember from the Vista days and so on. This is the documentation for Win2D, and you'll note that there are a couple of attributes that are marked up on here. For example, Atlas effect has no composition in bold, indicating that there is not an analog for this effect presently available inside composition. As I say, that may well change in the future. We can chain multiple effects together, and that's really neat because what we can do is we can use an effect as the source for the next effect, and we can carry on that chain as much as we would like. Obviously, there is eventually going to be some form of performance impact if we keep stacking these things together, but it allows us to achieve some really interesting effects, and we'll see some of those in my demo later on. The other neat thing about this is when we create an effect such as this Gaussian blur effect, we can specify a number of properties at the creation time. For example, we've got blur amount equals 32. One of the things that we have to do if we're going to use an effect is we have to actually pass it off and get it compiled. That is what's happening there with the compositor create effect factory, that we're registering our graphics effect with the factory. That's going to register that as part of the compositor and return us back a reference to that. We can make these properties dynamic. So for example, you'll see here that the blur amount is no longer declared statically in the Gaussian blur effect, but instead we have down on the create effect tree line, we have this property array of strings where we can say blur effect.blur amount. Blur effect relates to the blur effect name here. Blur amount is the property that we're going to be setting. So we can insert a scalar value, and for those of you who remember my animation video, a scalar is just a single float. We can then inject into that the outcome of this evaluation. So for example, this would be the slider value that would then set the blur amount for our effect, and so we can change that over time. which then lends itself well to animation. So we can create a scalar keyframe animation as an example, and we can animate from 0 to 32 over a time span of 300 milliseconds. And taking our brush properties, we can start an animation that will change the blur amount. We'll demonstrate that a little bit later as well. So why don't I dive in and show you some code. Hi, as I started experimenting with effects to put together this video, I built a Effect Explorer style application that made it easy for me to switch between different styles of effects and so on. And I realized that that might actually be pretty interesting for you guys to see how I built that. So this is the application that I put together, and as you can see, it's showing a live webcam. It actually has an effect sitting on top of here, which is where the UI drops in for each of my effect components. And so I thought, yeah, this might be somewhat interesting to see. This is a real headache of an effect, I know. So this video will also include me building this Explorer, as well as showing you how these effects can be applied. So I've already created myself an empty UWP application, and so let's go about building the UI for my Effect Explorer. So I'm going to have a grid, I'm going to have some row definitions. First row definition is going to be star sized, as per usual, if you've seen any of my UIs. And then my second one is going to be auto height. So sized based upon the content. And this time, for a radical departure from my regular demo UIs, I'm going to have some columns. Column definition. First column is going to have a fixed width, even, not height, of 320. And then the remainder one is going to be star sized. Okay, so there's my UI. It's amazing. There is the preview of that UI. Okay, so let's start putting some components in there. So on my design, this left-hand side is going to be the list of my drop-in effect components. So let's just put a list view in. It's going to be a list view. It's going to be in grid.row span. It's going to be 2 because I want to fill both rows, and the grid.column, just to be explicit, is going to be 0. Okay, so that's my list view, masterful as it is. Then I'm going to have something to display my webcam content, and that is the capture element. So the capture element, I'm going to call that preview control, which is effectively previewing the input from my webcam. And it's going to be in grid.row, not row span, row 0, it's going to be grid.column 1, but I also want this to fill both rows, so I'm going to have grid.rowspan equals 2. Okay, so that's my element, and I'm also going to want to have the content to stretch to fill. Okay. Now, what I should actually point out is most of this code is directly lifted from a sample on docs.microsoft.com called Display the Camera Preview. So the stuff to set up the webcam and so on is just literally almost word for word copying from here, just to get you up and running very, very quickly. So feel free to jump out to this location so that you can learn more. Anyway, in order to be able to use our webcam and webcam previews, we actually need to make sure we've updated our app manifest. So if I open up my app manifest, get our nice GUI, I'm going to go to capabilities. I need to make sure that I've checked microphone and webcam. Okay, so those have been added in. If I only check webcam, then it still won't start up properly because my webcam has a microphone built in apparently. Okay. So here we are, we've got our capture element. The final thing we need to do is we need to drop in a background. Now this is actually some preparatory work for adding an effect down the line, but what we're going to do is do a simple background initially. So we're going to do effect UI host background. And we're going to have a min height on here so it's always displayed of 200. We're going to set it up in grid.row. I wish it would not choose row span each time. 1. And it's grid.column 1. Okay, and for the time being, we're going to just hard code in some colors. So we'll have light cyan, and we'll have some opacity here of 0.5 so we can see the underlying content of the web view. Webcam view, I should say, not web view. Something completely different. Now we're going to drop in another grid that's going to be in the same position, but because grid convention is items declared lower in the order will appear above previous controls, then this effect UI host will appear above this. So if this is transparent, then we will see the background. Okay, and obviously we don't want to have a background set so that we can see through. So if I save this, if we have a look at our design, we can see here is our area where we'll be dropping in our UI. Here is the area of our list view, and this is where the webcam will show in this entire area here. Okay, so now we actually need to plumb in our webcam. So I'm going to switch over to the code behind. And now what we're going to do is start bringing in some code from the online sample. So bring that up. And so we're going to start off by bringing in some variable definitions. Add the namespace as we go. We've got this display request object. Now this is a very interesting object. This prevents our screen from going to sleep, or power saving mode to dim our display. And one thing that's actually an error in that article is they don't actually initialize the object. So I'm going to do that right here. Then I actually did mention to them about this problem, and they are actually already have a fix in place, and they'll be rolling it out shortly. So it may be in place by the time you go through this demo. So let's copy this. So now we're going to start up our preview. It's going to be an asynchronous task. Okay, so let's just talk through this one quickly. So asynchronous task, we initializing our media capture object. We're initializing it. Preview control, if you remember, that's the control we have on our XAML. Setting it to the media capture, so that's going to be the stream from media capture is going to be rendered in the preview control. We're going to wait for that to start. We then set off is preview and flag equal to true. This request active is what stops our screen from going to sleep. We need to make sure for every request active we perform, we also release it. And then we're also setting a preference here, exactly as it says. I'm not going to be rotating my desktop, but you may want to rotate your laptops and so on and so forth. Well, this will always keep it in a landscape orientation. Unauthorized access exception. As the note says here, if you've denied access to the camera in privacy, this will get thrown, but it also gets thrown if you haven't set up your manifest properly with the microphone and the webcam. Okay, so that's that. Let's save that. Let's jump back to the web page. We want to also be able to clean up after ourselves, so let's copy that and drop that in. So this is responsible for making sure that we release all of our resources associated with the camera. So if we're previewing, then we stop our preview. Then, because we need to do this on the UI thread, we're going to run it via the dispatcher. So we're going to set our source equal to null to release any references to media capture. We're going to, if our display request has been initialized, we're going to make sure we release that request, and then we dispose of media capture and so on. It's important to understand that in a lot of these system integration points, we're actually creating references that cross the COM boundary, and so we want to make sure that we release our references to those so those objects themselves can be recovered and be reused later. So that's going on there. Okay, next, what we got? So we are making sure that when we navigate from our view, which we've only have a single view in our application, so this isn't strictly necessary, but it will ensure that we clean up our camera asynchronously. And we're now also going to attach to the suspending event. whenever we minimize and maximize our application, goodness, I can't even select this. Whenever we minimize and maximize our application, we are suspended as a UWP app. That's not true 100% of the time because we have a slight delay, but in effect, we will be suspended. And so we want to release our resources as necessary when we do that. So here's our suspending event, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to do clean up camera async. It's a asynchronous operation, so I'll put await on here, and I'll say async here. Okay, what else do we have going on in this article? Oh, yeah. We actually have a bunch more in here to deal with deferrals. If you remember any of your UWP theory, we only have a certain amount of time to respond to suspending events. Otherwise, the system will just kill us if we run too long. What we can do is we can use a deferral to request more time. And so if we have a deferral requested, we can then clean up our camera async, which will release whatever objects we've specified and so on, and then we'll actually complete a deferral, which will then allow the system to continue suspending. You could also argue, well, that's great if we've been suspended, but what about if we've been resumed? So you could turn around and say application.current.resume, add an event on there. No, let's not do that. Let's just create a method. And so we could actually do something like async. What do we call it? Start. Okay, so we can call that method to start it. But one thing we actually haven't done right now is we don't start it when we load. So I'm going to add an event handler for loaded. And also make sure that we call start preview on there. So let's build this. Okay, it built. Let's see if it runs first time. Okay, so here we have our app UI running. So we can see we've got our webcam here, we've got our overlay down here where our UI is going to appear. We have an empty list here. But one of the first things that I really notice about this is this transparent UI element here really isn't doing a good job of obscuring what's going on behind it. It's actually somewhat distracting. You know, you're trying to read my shirt and so on and so forth. So this is actually a great opportunity at this point in time to introduce some effects that will actually improve this look of the UI before we actually go in and do anything else. So let's go about doing that. Okay, so how are we going to add these effects in? Well, as you may recall in the XAML, we have this background host here. So what we're going to do is we're going to use composition effects to place a blur effect on here. And in the future point in time, we'll add something more to do some tinting and whatever. So I'm going to remove this and then flick back over to the code. So on loaded, we're going to want to build our background. So let's create a method build background. So we've got our method. Okay, great. Now what are we going to do? So we need to start setting up composition and everything along those lines. And so if we remember from any of the other videos of mine you may have watched, or you may just know this yourself, we need to get hold of our good friend, the compositor. And so window.current.compositor gets hold of that. And the reason we're going to do that is we're going to start creating an effect. So let's turn around and create an effect. Visual. So this is something that's actually going to hold our effect, because effects are brushes. We paint a brush onto a sprite visual, and that is then what gets placed into the composition stack. So we're going to create our effect visual. So compositor first of all, We're going to create a sprite visual. If you remember from my video talking about visuals, that sprite visual is something that allows us to host our own content. A raw visual is generally a backing visual that we create from a XAML element, and we can do certain manipulations with that, but we can't directly create our own content on that visual. What we have to do is we have to add a sprite visual to it, or a container visual that contains one or more other sprites that will then allow us to paint some content. So we're going to be painting our effect onto this effect visual. We'll then be adding this effect visual to our background. So let's talk about an effect. So var graphics effect. We are going to create something called a Gaussian blur effect. Now we actually don't have a reference to this. So if I use IntelliSense, it would see, create types and so on, but I can't bring in a reference. One of the nice things about Visual Studio 2017 is we can now go and find NuGet packages that relate to unresolved references in our application. So I can click on this, and it's going to go and find and install that NuGet package for us, which I think is pretty awesome, to be honest. And so now we've got the Gaussian blur effect is in scope and available to us. And you can see up in our references here, Win2D UWP has been added. A quick segue, Win2D is a library that allows us to access some of the DirectX capabilities, but access it through C# as opposed to doing C++ code, and allows us to negotiate the objects related to interacting with DirectX in a much simplified and more user-consumable way. So Win2D provides us access into things like the Gaussian blur effect. So we've got this. We need to set a few properties on here. So blur amount is a value that, as you can probably guess, is how much we blur. So you may wonder why I'm using 34. Well, because it's more than 33 and less than 35. Basically, what I'm really getting at there is it's totally down to you and your aesthetic on how much blur effect you want. I happen to have selected 34. I think it does a reasonable job of blurring the background. We have a border mode, and there's a numerable that we can set hard or soft, and the idea is that if we select hard, then it honors the borders of the element in which we're blurring. If we say soft, then it will overlap those edges. I'm just going to be blurring the background brush, so it doesn't really matter whether I say hard or soft on here, but I'm going to specify hard. And I'm going to specify a source. So this is the input to the effect, and basically what the effect is going to be performed upon. So we could specify, say, an input image or something along those lines, but what we're actually going to do is we're going to create a new composition effect source parameter. This allows us to turn around and say we are going to have a property called background that we're going to assign at a later date, which will become the source for this effect. So that's what we've set up. So we've defined our effect. Now, if you've got any familiarity with working with DirectX or creating effects or doing anything at that kind of low level, one of the things you do is you define an effect and then you have to compile it. So the way that we do that with composition is we use an effect factory. And as with all things, the compositor, certainly all things composition anyway, gives us the access to the effect factory, and we're going to pass in the effect that we want it to compile. So this has the outcome really of registering this effect into the composition system and giving us a reference to that compiled effect. So now we have that, we can now create a brush. So let's call it effect brush. We could create a brush that is going to reference our effect factory, and we're going to create a brush from it. So we now have the brush that represents the outcome of the effect, obviously not yet running. In order to tie these things together, we can set a source parameter, which is going to be of the name background brush, or background I should say. And we're going to tell it what the actual value is. So now we're going to use something pretty cool, which is we're going to use the compositor again to create a backdrop brush. What that does is it will take whatever is currently being rendered behind a specific control and pass it in as a brush. What we're then doing in this line is we're saying, take the background of whatever control this brush is being attached to, pass that as the background parameter into this composition effect. It's then going to perform a Gaussian blur, and the outcome of that will effectively be the outcome of the effect brush. Okay, with me so far? Maybe, maybe not. We created an effect visual above. Nope, not effect brush, effect visual. This is the element that's going to contain the outcome of this brush, on which we're then going to paint into our UI. So effect visual brush is going to be set to effect brush. Okay, and then we are going to use element composition preview to set element child visual, and this is going to be of our effect UI host background, and it's going to be the effect visual. So I'm going to make a quick note here. Set the size. We always need to make sure that we set the size of our visuals when we paint them onto an object. That way that we are actually going to be displayed, because they start off with no dimensions whatsoever. So you may be adding it in, but it won't be visible because it's a 0, 0. So we always want to make sure we set the size. Because we're going to be placing this on an element that can be resized over time, we want to make sure that it's set to the size of that element and responds to any size changed events on that element. So we're going to do that in a moment. But I'll refer you back to my video where we talk about visuals, but in effect what we're doing is we're taking the outcome of our effect UI host background element, which, to remind you, is this grid here, which is positioned here. And we are then going to paint on top of that this effect visual. Okay? So let's set the size. I'm going to create a method called resize visual. So we're going to create that method. Now, in order to handle the visual here, I need to change this from being a local variable to a member variable. So let's introduce a field. So that's introduced that field, and now I can quickly reset the size of this visual. So I'm going to put a guard in here to make sure that we don't call this if our effect visual hasn't been initialized. We'll just return. But then basically we're going to set effect visual dot size. It's going to be a vector 2, and the dimensions are going to be based upon our effect host UI. So we need to cast it to float. Effect host UI actual width, float, actual height, and that's set to the size. So now this will be sized based upon our background. We also need to respond to the size changed event on there. So I'm going to attach an event handler up here. Size changed, and we'll just use the lambda syntax here. And we're going to say resize visual. So anytime our host UI changes, then we're going to drop in or update our visual, if it's been assigned, to that value. So let's compile. So what we have is we have a Gaussian blur effect that's been applied to the background shown behind the grid that's in this place. We've then created a sprite visual, applied that Gaussian effect to the backdrop, and then sized that sprite visual so that it fits over the top of this area. So now if I resize, you can see that the brush still moves and changes in direct proportion to the background, we can see as I'm moving around that all of this is totally live. There's no lag here, and again it all works as we resize and so on and so forth. So you can see that this is very much very high performance capability that the compositor gives us the ability to use. And so we can see how we could really quickly add interest to our applications using this approach. So now let's go about actually creating the reusable components that we're going to use to demonstrate some of the different effects. So in order to do that, I'm going to start off by creating myself an effects folder in my solution. So let's add a new folder. I'm going to call it effects. And now what I want to do is I want to find the behaviors that are going to be reusable across my different components. And in order to do that, I'm going to create myself an interface. So let's add a new item, which is going to be an interface. So I can say code, interface, and then just specify I want effect UI. So this is going to define what an effect UI component is going to promise to deliver. And first and foremost, I'm going to say my effect is going to be performed against a framework element. So I need to have a reference to that. So let's call that target element. And it's going to be a getSet property. Okay, then I want to have an operation where I'm going to apply an effect. Makes sense. If I select an effect from my list, I want to be able to apply it. And then when I deselect it and apply another one, I want to remove the effect from this one first. So that seems to be the sort of behavior that I'm going to want to have on my components. The next thing I want to do is I want to have a way to refer to these components. So I'm going to create another class that I'm going to use to create lists of components available. So let's add a new component. It's just going to be a regular class this time, and we're going to call this one Effect UI Wrapper. And this is going to give me a couple of interesting things. So let's make it a public class. And we're going to have a property on here. It's going to be a string, effect name, something I can display in the list. I'm going to have another property, which is going to be of type. And this is actually going to be the user control type for the drop-in UI element. And that's so I can create an instance of it in this method here. It's going to return back an instance that implements this interface, and we're going to call it create, so it's a factory method. And I'm just going to use the activator to create an instance of the user control type. And then we're going to make sure we cast that to effect UI. Oh, we're complaining because when I created my interface, I didn't mark my interface as public. So let's do that. Public, there we go. That gets rid of that error. Okay, so very simple. This is just a simple factory method that will create an instance of my user control whenever I want to. So that's my kind of infrastructure. There's one more thing that I want, which will be my list of effects. So let's add another class. And I'm going to call it effects source. And so make this a public class. And I'm just going to make this an observable collection of type effect UI wrapper. And I'm just going to create a custom constructor on here. Let's create a constructor. And what we're going to do inside here is we're going to initialize our list. Okay, so it's going to be an effect UI wrapper, and that has a property effect name. So let's update our UI. So our UI, we have our list view, and our list view isn't doing anything at all right now, but we actually want to show a list of our components. So let's set up its item source. And we're going to use xbind to an effects source property. that actually doesn't exist yet, so let's go ahead and create it. So I'll hit F7 to navigate to my code behind. Let's create a property. It's going to be effects sort, if I could spell it. And we're going to make it equal to a new effect source. So that effectively initializes effect source, too many effects and effects going on here. So that's now set, and so if I come back to my, using Shift F7 to get back to my XAML, we should see that this will resolve. Okay, finally it resolved once I built it and once the reference is updated. Okay, so we've got our list view, but we also need to have a data template for our items template. So list view dot item template data template. We're going to use xbind, so we need to specify the data type, and we're going to reference effect UI wrapper. Okay, that's that in scope, and then we're going to just have a simple text block, and we're going to set text equal to, and we have IntelliSense that tells us its effect name that we want to place into there. And so that's our data template setup. Okay, so we've created a basic infrastructure here, but we still don't have any effects. So how are we going to go about creating our effects? Well, because we want to implement our iEffective UI interface, there's going to be a bunch of common code across all of our effects. So I'm going to create a base class that's going to track these things for us. So let's create that. Add class, and this is going to be base effect control. Let's add this class. Okay, so let's update the accessor of this. So it's going to be public, and we're also going to make this abstract so that we have to create instances of it. Now the point of this is going to be the base class for our controls, so we're going to extend user control, and we're also going to implement iEffect UI. The whole point of these controls is that they are going to perform composition effects. So let's create a protected reference to an effect brush, and we'll just call that effect brush. We are going to be leveraging a sprite visual. So let's hang on to a reference to that, and we'll call that the effect visual. We know that we need to implement iEffect UI, and on there it requires us that we support the following. So let's implement those missing members. So we've got apply effect, remove effect, and we have our target element. I want to change this to be a backing field, to have a backing field, so I can actually do a quick refactor on that one. The reason for that is I want to hook into the size changed event whenever we change this target element. So we're going to assign that if the target element is not equal to null, I want to attach to size changed. As you recall, if our target element changes dimension, we want to change the size of our brush, and so this allows us to track that. So pretty much similar logic as we were doing before, we're going to update our brush size by calling resize visual. So inside here, we'll just put resize visual. So let's implement resize visual. Let's make it protected, so we can call it from derived classes as well. But in effect, we're going to do the same as we did before. So if our effect visual is equal to null, just return. This allows for issues related to timing, where we might have a resize event on our underlying element before we've created our visual. And then we're going to set our effect visual dot size equal to a new vector 2. Cast everything to a float, and so it's our target element dot actual width, comma, float. Okay, so that will make sure that that will update appropriately. Okay, what else have we got going on in here? So we have apply effect. So this is where we want to build a brush. And this is going to be something that we're going to implement in each effect. So we can actually put into here build brush, and we can actually call a protected abstract void build brush, so that anything that inherits from this base class has to create an implementation of build brush. We have remove effect, and actually we pretty much know what we're going to do in here. We know that if we're removing effect, we want to get rid of this subscription to this event. So let's drop this in here. And everything else, we really want to tidy up our references. So let's put some guards in here, and we say if our effect visual is not equal to null, then effect visual dispose, and then we can set our variable to null. Same with our brush. If the effect brush is not equal to null, if I could spell null, then we can dispose of that, and we can set it equal to null as well, letting go of any references to everything that's in here. But thinking forward, we may have some additional brushes and sprites and so on that we're creating in future effects that isn't just a singular visual and so on and so forth. So just for future expansion, we can create a custom remove effect method, and we can create a implementation of that can be overridden. So we just do a protected. So rather than making abstract as we have up here, we're actually going to give an implementation of this one so that you don't have to build something for it. Custom remove effect, but it's just going to have an empty body. And so this will, if we mark it up with virtual as well, then that gives a strong hint that this can be overridden. Oh, it should be custom, not custom-y. Okay, so we have those there. Okay, I think that forms the basis of our base control. So just to reiterate what's going on here is this is creating the infrastructure for our reused logic for every single one of our effect components. Now let's look at actually creating one. Let's do something simple. We've already seen the basics of how to do this, but let's create a blur effect control. So firstly, I'm going to add a new user control. Add new item, user control, and let's call it blur effect control. So by default, that's using or inheriting from user control, but we actually want to use our base effect control. So I'm going to change this to base effect control. Add a reference to that, and IntelliSense will eventually settle down. Now I need to go into the code behind, and I need to change this to be base effect control. Now, one thing you will notice is that the IntelliSense tends to be a little bit upset by changing these base controls. It actually will still compile correctly once we've implemented all of the various interfaces and abstract elements that we need. So if I click on here, then build brush is necessary to implement the abstract method that's defined in base effect control. So if I delete this, I should be able to compile. And you see compilation has succeeded, but we're still getting some IntelliSense issues. So let's have a look at our UI. In our UI, it's going to be very, very simple. We're going to have a slider control that we're going to use to control how much blur we're going to apply. You may remember when we used the effect earlier on, we had a blur amount. Well, we're actually going to use a control to vary that. So let's create it. Xname, call it blur slider. We are going to have a minimum value of 0. We'll have a maximum value of 100. We'll set up the header so that we know what we're altering. Blur amount. Put a margin on it so we're not butting up against the edges, and we'll track a value changed event. Now you can see IntelliSense is actually caught up and we've lost the red squigglies from under here. Takes a little bit of time. Okay, so what we have is we have a blur effect control that implements everything associated with our base class, which implements all the interfaces. So we can actually get to a point where we have the UI showing, even if it's not actually going to do anything at this moment in time. What we'll need to do is we need to add a reference to it in our effects source. So here we're going to add a new effect UI wrapper, and we're going to initialize that with effect name. It's going to be blur effect, and the type is going to be the type of our new control, blur effect control. So if we run the app now, we should see blur effect control in our list. And here it is. But obviously it's not doing anything yet because we haven't configured any interaction on our main page. So let's update that now. Okay, so in our main page, we want to obviously monitor when we've made a selection change on our list. We've just selected an effect we want to apply. So selection changed. Let's just create that method. So now what we're going to do is we actually need to create our effect for ourselves. So let's get an effect UI wrapper. This is what we're actually binding our list to. So the first item in our added items collection is going to be an effect UI wrapper. So I can do this. You could just as easily get selected item or something out of the list itself. The next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make sure, if we assume we may have an effect already in place, we want to make sure we clean up any effects that are on there. So let's create a cleanup effect UI host. So let's quickly recap what the effect UI host is. So that is this grid. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to add our user controls as children to this grid. And so that's how we're going to go about approaching that. So in our cleanup, so what we're going to do is we want to check to see if we have any children in our effect UI host. So if we have any children, we're going to iterate through the effect UI host children collection, and these we know are only going to be effect UI elements, effect UI elements. Let's just call it child, nice and simple. And what we're going to do is we want to tell it to remove the effect that it may apply to the target UI. Once we've told each child to remove the effect, there should only ever be one child, but we're just being very, very careful here and making sure we're cleaning it. We're then going to remove all the children from our effect UI host. So I can say children.clear. And so that removes any references between the user control and the effect UI host and vice versa, so that those items are available for disposal. So that cleans that up. So we're coming back to here. We've cleaned up our effect UI host. Now we want to actually add one. So effect UI is going to leverage the effect UI wrapper we've just selected, and we're going to actually just call create, which is going to give us an instance back of our effect UI. We can then, with confidence, know that we can add it to the children of our host. We also want to set the target element equal to our preview control. So if you remember, the preview control is the capture of element that's showing our webcam. We've got an error here, and that's because I haven't cast the create. And I want to specify that that is a user control, because we can only add controls. Now we can do this because our effect UI controls that are inheriting on base effect control, if we scroll up, we know that every single one of these is a user control first and foremost. So we can do this cast with confidence. So that creates that. Once we've set the target element, we can then tell our effect UI to apply the effect. So this is all fine and dandy. We can run this again. So we have our app running. If I select blur effect, we now see the UI drop down here. It's obviously not doing anything yet, but you can see how this actually works. And once we build up more lists here, you can see how as we change, this will remove this and then add in the next one, and so on and so forth. In fact, I can quickly simulate that if I go into the effects source, and I'll just add multiple entries for this blur effect. So we'll have 2, and we'll have 3. So now if I run it, so I select the first one, let's set the value over here. When I select number 2, you can see that everything resets. And we're not actually caching any of these things, we're disposing of all of them as we move between them. And so we're not seeing any changes here, and the UI remains the same, but it is being swapped out. Okay, so now we actually need to add our effect to our blur effect control. And it's actually very, very similar to what we've already done. So let's recap. We're going to build our brush. So we need a compositor. Var compositor equals window.current.compositor. We are going to set our effect visual, and remember we already have that in our base class, equal to the compositor.create sprite visual. We're going to create an effect equals new Gaussian blur effect. Our blur amount is going to be equal to the float of our blur slider dot value. So you can see how we can start associating this. Our border mode is still going to be hard, and our source is still going to be a parameter that we're going to inject, and it's still going to be background. Okay, so now we've got our graphics effect. We need our factory. So far, effect factory equals compositor, create effect factory, passing in our graphics effect. The effect brush, and remember this is already created in our underlying base class, is the effect factory, create brush. We're going to set our brush source parameter for background is again going to be equal to the compositor create backdrop brush. But whereas this time previously it was the section of the UI underneath the bottom pane, this is actually going to be the webcam. So we're pulling in all of the webcam live values, and that's what we're going to be updating. So now we're going to set our effect visual.brush equal to our effect brush. We're going to remember to hook in resize visual. Remember we implemented that in our base class so that we have it available to us. We then use element composition preview to set the child element, or child visual I should say, and this is going to be targeting our target element that we passed in when we actually created the instance, and we're obviously adding our effect visual to that. So if we run this, we don't see anything. Why do we not see anything? Well, we haven't actually hooked anything up to our slider changed. So let's set an initial value on our slider just so that we know that this line here is actually going to do some work. So let's set up a value equal to 32, which was the value we were using beforehand. So now let's run this up. Now if we choose it, we can see that we now get the blur effect applied. But again, we're only doing a one-time only here, we're not monitoring any changes. So let's add the code that will support updating that dynamically. So if we look at our blur effect control code behind, there is actually an override on the create effect factory that allows us to specify some properties. So it's going to be a new, it's an IEnumerable, so I'm going to just create an array of strings, and I'm going to initialize it in line, and I'm going to say blur effect dot blur amount. So I'm specifying that there's going to be a property that I'm going to animate based upon this name. Now in order to be able to refer to this, I need to give a name to this Gaussian blur effect, and it needs to be blur effect. Why does it need to be? Because I've called it blur effect here. So this is how the system will find the correct effect to update. And blur amount maps to this property here. So what I can do down in this slider changed is I can turn around and reach into my effect brush, and I can do a guard to make sure it's not null, because the blur slider effect value could change, or certainly when on initial assignment before I've actually created my brush. I need to put a null check in here. I have a properties collection on that brush, and I can overwrite a value. Insert scalar is interesting in that any of these insert methods will actually either insert a value if it's missing or replace the value if it's already set up. And so we want to replace the value of this string, of this property, with a float, and we're in the event handler for the slider value change, e.new value. So now if I run this, select blur effect, now as I move my slider, I can immediately control that effect. As you can see, as I jumped to blur effect 2, it went to the default value of 32. can change the value, jump to here, it's the same. So that's how you can create a simple blur effect control. Okay, now let's take advantage of this framework and create another effect component. This time we're going to create one that does a saturation. So I'm just going to copy this control. And let's rename it. We're going to do saturation effect this time around. So it's going to be a saturation effect control. Okay, now obviously we're going to have to go into the control itself and make sure the class name and everything is set up correctly. So this is saturation effect control. Make sure we set our constructor correctly. If we come into here, we're going to need to make sure we update our class name. Whilst we're at it, let's rename our blur slider. Let's call it saturation slider. Let's change our value changed. Let's just make it simple, slider on value changed. And let's change our header to saturation amount. Now I happen to know that the saturation maximum value is 1, so it's between 0 and 1. So we certainly don't want to set a value of 32. And we also want to change our step amount, because otherwise we will be jumping in too large increments as we slide around. Okay, so that's our slider. Now let's have a look at our code behind. Okay, so now we want to use a different effect, saturation. So let's start off by spelling saturation correctly. That's always a good place to start. Okay, saturation effect. We've got a name. Seems like we'll want to call that saturation effect. Oh, now I've misspelled it. Don't you hate strings? Saturation effect. Now obviously we don't have a blur amount. Instead we have saturation. IntelliSense will tell us it sets the intensity for the effect. We don't have a border mode, but we do still have a source. So let us update our property string, and it is the saturation property. Come down to here, change that on the changing. Okay, the only other thing we need to do is we need to register it in our effect source. So we can get rid of our duplications of the effect UI wrapper for blur effect. Now we're going to have saturation effect. And we can drop in our saturation effect control. Save that, run it. Okay, here's our blur effect. And now here's our saturation effect. 0 saturation all the way up to 1. So we can see how this has again been processed live. Now one of the things I'm not particularly happy with right now is obviously this UI. We can't see very well what's going on behind it, because although we've got our blur effect, it's actually just showing through too much of the background color, which makes our dark UI not stand out. So one of the things that we can do is let's change this, and it gives me a good opportunity to show some ways that we can actually combine effects. So to do this, we're going to go back to our main page.xaml.cs, our code behind, where if you recall we put in an effect for the UI background. So we want to update this to something different. So where are we? Where is our effect? Okay, build background. So this is our simple graphics effect where we're using a Gaussian blur. But we want to keep our blur, but we also want to tint our background color. We want to brighten it up a little bit so that we have greater contrast between our UI control and so on. So let's see how we would go about doing that. Well, let's comment out this for the time being. We're actually going to want to use a new type of graphic effect, and it's going to be a blend effect. As the name suggests, this allows us to blend two sources together. So it says combines two images. That's the IntelliSense. But as we know, we can actually do more than that with different sources and so on. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by specifying some properties on our blend effect. So we're going to have a mode. Now there are a ridiculous amount of different modes on here. Some of which, if you can see on here, the IntelliSense tells us that there is no composition support. You can see that highlighted here. So that means it's not been implemented in the composition layer. It's available in Win2D, but not in composition. So if I come down to, say, soft light, move my mouse over that one, this one is supported in composition. So I'm going to leverage this one. You can go out to the Win2D documentation and see a lot more information about these things and so on. I won't profess to be an expert about what all of the different parameters and types of effects you can achieve are. Background. So now what we're going to do is we're going to have a color source, if I could spell it. A color source effect. So what we're going to do here is apply a color as our background or image one, if you like, in our blend effect. So what we're going to set here is we're going to set ourselves a color, and we're going to use a light color because we want to brighten our background. So let's import our reference colors and let's use light cyan. Okay, so our blend effect background, or you could consider it to be image one, has been set to a color source effect that is using light cyan as a color. We're then going to set the foreground color, or you can consider it, or the foreground image I should say, or you can consider it to be image number 2, and we're going to reuse our Gaussian blur. So let's grab that. So uncomment those lines, and let's put a semicolon in there. So we have our Gaussian blur on here again, amount 34. Oh look, I was telling us we were using 32 before. No, it's apparently 34. Bad me. And so now what we've got is we've got a new graphic effect that's blending these things together. So let's just run this and see what we get. So immediately we can see that this is a much brighter surface here, and that's the effect of the color. Now if I bring in my UI, we can see we've got much greater contrast going on here. If I go to my saturation effect, again we can see we have much greater contrast, so we can still see our UI despite the fact that we're overly dark in the background. And so that gives you an idea of how we can bring together multiple effects to create the desired outcome that we're looking for. So I realize my video is starting to run a bit long at this moment in time, so I think what I will do is take some of the other things that I was going to show, such as animating effects and some of the other more advanced composed effects, and create another video that has those things in it. So I'll wrap up this particular demo at this point. Okay, you've seen a lot of code thrown around just there, so here are some of the resources that I found useful in developing these courses. And this is the end of the video.